In relation to an explicit commitment to a common defence, you know, that goes back to Article 17 of the Amsterdam Treaty in 1997. Thanks very much. Where it was stated that, and this is a treaty that Ireland signed up to, including the progressive framing of a common defence policy which might lead to a common defence should the European Council so decide. Yes, so the wording has changed in the Lisbon Treaty, but this concept of a European defence goes back, you know, 11 years. It's not new, it's not novel. And again, you know, it cannot take place unless Ireland agrees at the Council of Ministers for a common defence policy to take place. And my understanding of that is that if an Irish representative on the Council of Ministers were to be in favour of this, that there would have to be a referendum here in Ireland to support that. So I think there is, I think it's perhaps an oversimplification to say that, you know, a weak or a person without much moral fibre might go along to Europe to do that. I don't think that they can. I think there's a requirement for a referendum to be held in order to endorse that. And I think, given Ireland's history, I think that's extremely unlikely. In relation to the St. Petersburg tasks, let's not fool ourselves. The St. Petersburg tasks, which have been around for some time now, for almost a decade, cover humanitarian and rescue tasks for European military forces, crisis management, peacekeeping and peace enforcement. And contrary to what Carol might assert, I mean, I don't care what the legislature here might say. Peace enforcement means combat. It means warfighting. And so therefore, even though under Article 28b, even though these tasks are widened, there's nothing contained within them that isn't previously included under that catch-all phrase, peace enforcement. It's perhaps a little bit more explicit. But peace enforcement means full spectrum combat operations. And again, this is not new or novel to Ireland. We were involved in full spectrum combat operations in the Congo back in the 1960s. So there's nothing new there. And it doesn't necessarily represent a sinister development. The use of the word terrorism in the context of the United States global war on terror might provoke an emotional response on the part of some audiences and in some stakeholder groups. But it's quite simply this. Would we respond according to clause 188R in a spirit of solidarity were a European neighbour to suffer a man-made or natural disaster? Again, there's nothing new or novel here. During the Second World War, which we euphemistically refer to as the emergency, we did send ambulances and fire brigades to Northern Ireland, when Belfast was bombed. So this concept is not new, it's not novel. And again, I would disagree with Carol's interpretation. Article 188R, the so-called Solidarity Clause, does not bind us in a compulsory way to military engagement if one of our fellow member states are attacked. It states quite explicitly that the Union and its member states shall act jointly in a spirit of solidarity. If a member state is the object of a terrorist attack or victim of a natural or man-made disaster, the Union shall mobilise all of the instruments at its disposal, including the military resources made available by the member states. In other words, they can only use the military resources that are made available. They can only use instruments that are at their disposal. And it is quite clear that our military assets would not be at the disposal of a European partner if something were to happen, because we must satisfy the triple lock in order to deploy our troops overseas. And that really is the bottom line. In relation to permanent structured cooperation, I have a lot of contacts in NATO of necessity over the last number of years. I've built up quite a number of contacts in NATO. And NATO is not a monolithic bloc with unanimity of purpose, as it is sometimes portrayed here. NATO is a group of disparate nations who are entered into a military alliance. And NATO is under strain at the moment. And they're finding it very difficult to keep their solidarity, particularly in relation to operations in Afghanistan. The idea that the European Union at this stage in its development could mirror NATO through permanent structured cooperation is farcical. And both NATO and non-NATO military colleagues that I have, or former military colleagues, would refer to the European Rapid Reaction Force as the European Rapid Reaction Force. So Europe may have ambitions in that direction, but as I've said to you earlier, they've always had these ambitions. They've always harboured these ambitions, some for very pro-social and legitimate reasons. But the idea of a pan-European army similar to NATO anytime soon is just not a realistic prospect. In relation to the European Defence Agency, it's been in existence since 2004. The treaty will, formalise its existence. There are those who would argue that it is a charter for increased expenditure on armaments and munitions. But to be honest with you, the EU already spends 40% of what the United States spends on security and defence. And we've had enough of what the Americans spend on security and defence. We've all seen globally the outcomes and byproducts of that, both expected and unanticipated. So what the EU wants is something approaching 40% of the United States capability, and certainly its political influence. And I think everybody in the room, no matter what your ideological or political orientation, will have to agree, there has to be something to challenge US political and military hegemony in the world. And I think the EU, why not? I think it's a legitimate pro-social aspiration to rationalise their defence spend. For example, at the moment, there are 16 different research and development programmes throughout Europe looking at how to manufacture more efficient armoured personnel carriers. Armoured personnel carriers that are used by NGOs, that are used in crisis management and humanitarian assistance tasks. That is a waste of taxpayers' money. This is money that could be spent more efficiently on heavy lift transport for troops and aid workers, for cancer services, for education or whatever. So I don't think that, I think it's unfair to characterise the EDA, the European Defence Agency, as a charter for increased expenditure on military hardware. It is an attempt by the EU to rationalise its defence spend and to make our capabilities more coherent for pro-social reasons. Look, finally, I look forward to the question and answer session, because I think that's probably going to be the most productive session of the evening. I've tried to address the points that Carol has raised, and I'm sure that Joe and Rory will pick up on others and broaden it out. There is nothing in the Lisbon Treaty, and I have read it all, and I've read all of the preceding articles and documents that the military clauses and articles refer to. And I can tell you, in my opinion, there is nothing in the Lisbon Treaty that threatens our neutral status. I think there's a lot in it that will allow us to bring our neutrality to the table. But I would say this, and I'd have to agree with Carol on this: do you trust the government? No way! Just bear with me, I'm nearly finished. Have a look at each of the political parties. Have a look at their policy documents as they apply to Ireland's neutrality. Fine Gael makes some very, very interesting assertions, and they have some very interesting aspirations in that area. I will allow Rory to elaborate on what the Labour Party has to say about these matters if he so wishes. Fianna Fáil, you'd have to look at their track record in relation to this. But to be honest with you, my gut feeling is I'm more inclined to trust Europe than I am to trust Leinster House. So for that reason, I would say to you, don't, if you have a problem with the government, as Rory was saying to me, change the team, don't destroy the stadium. Look at the Lisbon Treaty objectively on its merits and its demerits and make your decision. But I would just finally say, I can see nothing in that treaty that dilutes our neutral status. In fact, I think it enhances it. Thanks for your attention.